Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And for today's episode, we're going to go back to 2011 to take a quick look at the first album that ever turned me onto the music of Canadian punk rock songstress, Miss Jenny Wu. The album in question is entitled Alberta Rose, and you know, for me, one of the funny things about sort of entering into middle age, although at this point in time I sort of hope that I'm past middle age. I mean, I don't exactly want to live to be 90 here, son. Let's just be perfectly honest with each other. There really isn't much positive that ever comes out of that. But for me, one of the funny things about sort of entering into what they call middle age is those things that sort of make you start to feel old in comparison to, you know, younger people. And for me, at least in my experience, it usually comes back to either music or, you know, pop culture. And the fact that Jenny Wu has been in the game for almost 20 years is something that absolutely blows my mind. I still think of Jenny Wu as being a relatively new artist. And this album in particular, Alberta Rose, the fact that this album is almost 15 years old is something that just seems virtually impossible to me at this point in time. But as I mentioned before, this was the very first album that I ever heard of Jenny Wu's. Now, I don't remember specifically if I bought this album, you know, immediately upon its release or not too long thereafter, but I do remember purchasing this album in either 2011 or 2012. And the reason why I do remember that is because I was living in Seattle at the time, and I ended up moving out of Seattle towards the back end of 2012. So I remember that I bought this album somewhere in that sort of loose time frame, and I bought this album at a record store that was, and probably still is, one of the best record stores in the city. It was a place called Singles Going Steady. Now, this was a place that was as handy as it was dangerous, at least for me, because I lived just a few blocks down the street from this place in downtown Seattle, and this was a place that I basically just signed my entire paycheck over to. But my favorite thing about the record store, which actually was pretty much everything because it was a punk rock specialty record store, but specifically my favorite thing about the record store was that it had this huge collection of Oi imports and bootlegs, which was the first place I ever stumbled upon this album, Alberta Rose by Jenny Wu. There was just something about the artwork that sort of intrigued me, and I remember I picked this album up on CD at the time, and I took it up to the counter, and I remember that the guy who ran the store asked me if I had heard the album or if I was familiar with who Jenny Wu was, and unfortunately I sort of had to plead ignorant on both counts. I'd never heard this album. I did not know anything about this particular artist, but I remember he told me, he's like, yeah, man, I really dig this album. It's unique, it's cool, it's got kind of an acoustic Oi type vibe. I think you're really going to like it. So I purchased it, I took it home, I listened to it, and I immediately became a huge fan. Now, at this point in time, the catalog of Jenny Wu is something that I celebrate pretty much all the way through. But this album in particular has a very sort of special place in my record collection. Now, there are a few albums that I have sort of set aside and designated as my Monday morning albums. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, Jim, what is a Monday morning album? Well, if you think about it, it's relatively self-explanatory. These are those albums that I listen to when, you know, you're sort of coming out of a nice, long, relaxing weekend and you're feeling somewhat uninspired and somewhat unmotivated to go back to work on Monday morning. These are the albums I listen to get me up, get me moving, and get me out of the house. Now, I have a job that I like. It's something that I've been doing for over 20 years. It's something that, you know, I think I'm relatively good at, but the place that I'm currently employed is in a very affluent suburb right outside of the city of Nashville, and the clientele that we sort of cater to have a tendency to be very entitled, very demanding. Now, what I do for a living, I think you could sort of classify as, you know, skilled labor, and I have found that sometimes dealing with a clientele that I deal with on a daily basis today is, in its own way, a skill set of its own, which is something that I've actually, not to be pat yourself on the back Johnson here, but I think it's something I've gotten used to. I think it's something that I've gotten relatively good at. But there are days still when my job is a real punch in the seeds, and there are days I just don't want to deal with it. So on those days, I have a handful of records that I listen to to sort of get me fired up, get me feeling good. And to me, this is one of those records that, you always feel better coming out of this record than you do coming into this record. This record is very life-affirming, it's empowering, it's inspiring. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily fair to sort of label Jenny Wu as positive punk. I mean, ironically, there are some sort of negative connotations to that label of positive punk. But in my opinion, Jenny Wu is somebody that brings a lot of positivity into her music. It is empowering. It is very inspiring. Now, I don't have children. You're welcome for that. But if I had children, a daughter in particular, this is the type of artist, Jenny Wu, that I would want my daughter to listen to. This is an artist that I feel like is a tremendous role model for young women. She is smart, she's strong, she's independent, she's authentic, she's tough. I mean, take a look at this chick. Do you think that she takes much guff off of anybody? Not likely. Anyway, this album was released on April 18th, 2011. I purchased this album not too long thereafter, and this is an album that remains one of my records that I listen to in very heavy rotation. I love the production on this record. I've always loved the artwork on this sleeve. Like I said, for many years I had this album on CD. It wasn't long ago that I actually finally found this album on vinyl, so it is now a prized piece of my library. Now, this album sort of features one of the things that Jenny Wu is most known for, and that is this album has a lot of songs that you would sort of classify as being that sort of acoustic, oi type sound. That is something that is her signature. Now, there are several songs on this record also which feature a full live electric punk band. Those songs are awesome as well. Really, there isn't much clunkage on this album at all. The first song on this album is the title track, Alberta Rose. This one is one of the sort of acoustic oi tracks. I remember the first time I listened to this record, like I said, I bought this record at a place called Singles Going Steady in Seattle. I took it home and I listened to it, and I had a conversation with the guy who ran the store about this album. And as I was sort of walking home with this record, I was trying to picture in my head what acoustic oi sounds like, because I've always associated oi, which is one of my favorite subcategories in the punk rock world. But of course, you think of bands like Last Resort and The Business and the Foreskins, and very not acoustic, at least most of the stuff that I had ever heard, at least up to that point in time. So I remember I got this record home, and this first song sort of dropped in. I was like, oh, okay. The song is called Alberta Rose. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Jenny Wu is from Edmonton, Alberta originally. And it's funny, back when I worked in San Francisco, I had a client who had gone to school up in Edmonton. And Edmonton is a place that I've never been to. And I was like, oh, Edmonton, that's cool. What's it like? And he said, cold. I said, oh, okay. What else? Doesn't matter. And I remember sort of accepting him at face value. I was like, okay. I've never been there. It sounds cold. I mean, I've only been to, in terms of traveling to Canada, I've only been to Victoria, Vancouver, and Toronto, all of which I thought were quite lovely. And yeah, I'd totally go to Edmonton if I had an opportunity to. Now, that being said, when it comes to hockey, I'm a Jets fan. And at some point in time, I am going to take a pilgrimage up to Winnipeg to go to a Jets game. Although I've heard that the weather in Winnipeg is no cupcake either. But this is one of my favorite songs on the record. This is a song that is sort of talks about being a traveler, somebody that has sort of lived their life on the road. Now, according to her bio, Jenny Wu has toured in something like 65 countries. She's got projects on 2 continents. And if I'm not mistaken, she is currently based out of Ottawa, Ontario. But what this song talks about is, despite all of that, in her heart, she remains an Alberta girl, an Alberta Rose, if you will. And that is where I find this song to be very relatable. I am somebody that has traveled around a fair amount in my adult life. Now, I've not been to 65 countries, sadly. I don't have a skill set that would take me into 65 countries kicking ass like she does, but I do what I can. But in my travels, at least around the United States, I've lived in 8 different states. I've made acquaintances all over the country. I currently live in Nashville, Tennessee, but at my heart, I remain an Oakland guy. Oakland is where my home is. That is what I identify. Now, I didn't grow up in Oakland. I grew up in a very small town in Northern California, but I moved down to the Bay Area in 1996, which is really when I sort of discovered a lot of who I was. So for me, Oakland is something that is very near and dear to my heart. That's sort of how I connect to this song. If, despite all of her travels, Jenny Wu is still allowed to be the Alberta Rose, I'm going to claim, in spite of all of my travels, that I get to be the Oakland Turd. You understand? Anyway, I love this song. It is something that I very much relate to. It's one of my favorite songs on the record, which is actually setting the bar relatively high because I think that this album is pretty much the biscuits, at least as far as I'm concerned. The second song on this album is a song called What I Am. This one also sort of falls into that acoustic oi sort of category. To me, this song is about empowerment. The empowerment that comes from knowing who you are, the fact that integrity and authenticity are something to be celebrated, the importance of giving time to those who celebrate and support who you are, and if you are sincere and true to yourself, at the end of the day, you will find your community. This is a sort of theme that is sort of consistent throughout the songwriting of Jenny Wu. Again, this is another one of those songs. This is kind of why this album is on my my list of Monday morning records, because it really makes you feel sort of proud of who you are and where you come from. And despite the fact that you don't always necessarily get accepted by society, the norms of society, and trust me, I work in the mecca of norminess. It's okay. You just have to be who you are. You will find your people, and integrity and authenticity are something that are to be celebrated, my son. Anyway, the next song after that is a song called We Don't Need Their Respect. Again, sort of loosely in the same vein as the last song. Now, this song has more of an electric, full-on punk rock band sound to it. I actually really like both styles of the music on this record. If I had to choose, I don't know, I kind of like both. I like the oi stuff. I like the acoustic stuff, I should say, but when she plays with the full electric band, this song is a real kick-ass punk rock song. This song asks the question, is it worth being respected by the unrespectable? Is it important to be seen as honorable by those who have no honor? It describes the comfort that comes from standing up for what is right, even if that requires you to swim against the current, having the onions to look injustice in the eye and say, fuck you. This is another song about self-empowerment and integrity, and this song reminds me in particular of a client I have now. As I mentioned before, I have a job where I work in a very affluent, very conservative, very entitled, sort of judgy sort of environment, and I have one customer or client in particular who sees me on the semi-regular, and honestly, he's not a bad guy. He's just somebody that comes from a totally different background than I do. I feel like this is a guy who comes from a lot of money. He always talks about having a lot of money, and he, despite the fact that he appreciates what I do for a living, he thinks I'm good at it. He's always very complimentary as to what I do in my sort of vocation. He's also very passive-aggressively judgmental. He always sort of makes fun of the way I dress. He makes fun of the music that I like. He points out the fact that I'm much too old to look the way that I look, and I should be thinking towards the future. And he points out always the way that I dress in particular, and he's always like, look at you. You look like you sleep in a park, and I wear monogrammed golf shirts. We're roughly the same age. I'm mid-40s. He's probably mid-50s, so we're roughly the same age. And I don't dislike the guy. I actually sort of find him to be entertaining because he's so just upfront and abrasive. It's not even passive-aggressive. Earlier I said it's sort of passive-aggressive. It's not passive-aggressive. He's just a judgmental douche. But he is who he is. But at the end of the day, although he and I get along, we have pleasant enough conversations. Whenever I hear this song, or since I've started working at the current job I have, and I hear the song, he's the first guy that pops into my mind because I ask the question, is it important to be respected by somebody who doesn't respect you? Is it important to be seen as honorable by somebody that doesn't think that you have any honor? I don't know. It's all about being true to yourself, which is something that you can take me or leave me, but I am somebody that is genuinely fairly authentic. I would make the argument. Now, I'm not somebody that's going to just heap compliments upon myself. Trust me when I tell you that. But I am who I am, and this guy, he's the person that I always think of in particular when I hear this song. He's just this like ass in a way, but I kind of like him because he's just such an ass about it. Anyway, he's sort of the extreme when it comes to the people that I work with. Most people that I work with in my job have a little bit more decorum than that. In fact, this guy even prides himself on the fact that he has no filter and he's just going to say whatever he wants. And, you got to bring your thick skin, which, I have thick skin. This isn't all blubbage, okay? Some of this is thick skin. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've developed a little bit of a shell, if you know what I mean. Anyway, the fourth song on side one is a song called The Evil Within. This is another one of the sort of electric punk rock songs. I really love this song. This is a song about somebody that we've probably all met. Somebody like the main character in this song. I mean, have you ever met somebody and just almost immediately they give off this sort of ickiness? I mean, there's a situation where you meet somebody and you're like, man, that guy is not snug. Now, for what I do for a living, and I'm not turning this into Jim's vocational hour, but one thing that I do is I meet a lot of people in my daily life. I meet more people in a year than most people probably meet in their lives. So I've definitely met a lot of people like the main character in this song. I was thinking about this the other day, driving around my car, listening to this record, trying to think of what this song reminds me of. And several years ago, there was a news program that was very popular, and it was called To Catch a Predator. And based on what I do for a living, even before that, I was just really into To Catch a Predator. I'm not normally into trash TV or reality TV, but I just got really sucked into that show, To Catch a Predator. But I remember when that show was popular, thinking to myself, because I have a job where I work so closely with the public all the time, I thought, man, I've met these guys. Because all these guys on that show, if you ever remember watching To Catch a Predator, they all just look like norms. They all look like math teachers. They all look like guys who had tea times. But they were these just wretched, disgusting human beings. I remember thinking to myself, man, I've met these guys. I know I have dealt with these guys in my professional life. But that was what I was thinking of the other day when I was listening to this record in particular, trying to come up with thoughts on each song, because the main character in this song, The Evil Within, is just not somebody that you want to give much of your time to. I love this song. The next song after that is probably my favorite song on the record. Actually, scratch that. This is probably my favorite song in the entire Jenny Wu catalog, and that is the song I'll Rise Again. This one is in the acoustic vein, and to me this song is punk rock. I mean, if I were going to create a 100-song punk rock compilation that you're going to put into a time capsule, bury into the ground for future generations to discover. And the name of the compilation was This Was Punk Rock. This was what we were all about. This was our music. This was our community. This was our soundtrack. This song will definitely be on that 100 This is punk rock compilation. For me, this song embodies what it is to be punk rock, be part of the punk rock community. Now, I grew up in a very small town up in Northern California. I was a total outcast in my high school. I was a throwaway kid as far as my general peer group was concerned. Anything you could do in my high school to repel girls, I ruled at. After I graduated from high school, I did the thing that I was supposed to do, I thought I was supposed to do, and that was I began attending college classes not too far from my hometown. But in 1996, I decided that although I was getting decent grades in school, I was just sort of wasting my time, spinning my wheels, if you will, because I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I was just going to school because I thought it's what you're supposed to do. I wasn't passionate about it. So I decided that I was going to take an academic hiatus and I was going to venture out on my own. And in 1996, September of 1996, I moved from my hometown down to the Bay Area. And not long after that, I discovered this whole community of people that were like me, the freaks, the weirdos, the losers. And although I had already began to develop a sort of taste for this style of music up in my hometown, which was very rural, there wasn't a community like there was when you moved to a more urban area, at least back in those days. Now, keep in mind, this is pre-internet, this is pre-social media, this was just having to go out there and sort of dip your toe into the water of this community. And I immediately felt as if I belonged. I felt as if I had found my community. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I've never been the guy who has a million friends. I'm somebody now who has very few friends. I'm sure that's not very difficult for you to imagine. But to me, it was never really even about having friends. It was just about having this community. Something that made you feel as if there were people like you, people that had your back. And for me, that is the main reason why I can never imagine not being a part of this music, not being a part of this scene. Now, as I mentioned a couple times on this video, I'm middle-aged, man. I'm not a young kid anymore. And occasionally, sometimes people be like, hey, man, aren't you ever going to outgrow that shit? And it's hard to imagine. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, can you be 70 years old and still listen to GBH? And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know, but if I live that long, I'm not saying I want to, but if I live that long, I might try it out. Who knows? Because I can't imagine turning my back on this community. It meant so much to me. I mean, this was literally like a religious experience. And I've met people who were, punk rock people. They were into this style of music. Then you run into them a few years later on, and they've got on the golf shirt and the khakis, like, oh yeah, I was kind of into that stuff for a while, but, I sort of outgrew it, and no judging you. But for me, that just isn't my experience. It's never been my experience. I'm not, nor have I ever been, a casual music fan. I mean, I can't relate to people who, you ask, hey, what kind of music you like? Oh yeah, whatever's on the radio. Morgan Wallen's pretty snug. I can't even come close to relating that. Music is my life. It is my religion. So to me, this song basically says that a lot more articulately than I just did. Like I said, if I were going to make a 100 song compilation for future generations to open in a time capsule, say 500 years from now, and say, this was punk rock. To me, the song I'll Rise Again is on it. This is probably my favorite song of her, at least in her solo catalog. I love it. Never get tired of it. The first song on side 2 is a pretty heavy punk rock song called Our Kind. This song touches on the misconception that many people have about the skinhead subculture, thinking they're fascist, thinking they're racist, etc. As a young kid, I remember thinking that when I would, when I was a young kid, I used to spend my summers up in Oregon because my grandparents lived in Oregon, and my parents sort of shipped my brother and I off up to Oregon to spend our summers up there. And we'd go up to Portland once or twice a summer. My grandparents were very young people. Or very young people. They were very small town. They were not very young people. They were very small town people. And so we went to Portland once or twice. Somewhere back in those days, Portland had a big skinhead community downtown. Now, I don't know that they were racist skinheads or non-racist skinheads, but when I was a kid, I remember seeing these guys in downtown Portland. And because of the way that skinheads had been portrayed in the media and in film back in those days, and I said the same thing before just about punk rock in general. I mean, when I was a kid, if you went back and you watched films from like the early 1980s or television shows, you know, the punk rock character was always a dullard. He was always a dunderhead. He was always up to no good. He was always up to trying to create, you know, adversity for the hero. So I remember the first time I sort of discovered what punk rock was, and I first discovered punk rock through seeing the Rebel Yell video for Billy Idol on MTV. My dad told me, he's like, that's punk. And I remember being scared of it. I was like, oh, I'm a good kid. I don't want to mess around with that guy. But I had that same sort of opinion when I would go up to Portland and you'd see these skinhead dudes walking around Portland. Now, I'm not a skinhead, nor have I ever been a skinhead. I don't claim to be a skinhead, but I do know enough about the tradition to understand that most of these people, or most of these misconceptions are simply that. Now, recently, I was playing a song for somebody, and they pointed out the fact that it was a skinhead song because one of my favorite bands of all time is the almighty Evil Conduct, and I played them an Evil Conduct song, and they got all offended because they said, well, that's skinhead music. And of course, I think they're living under this sort of misconception that all skinheads are racist and fascists and shitheads. And I was like, yeah, it's skinhead music. It's like the greatest music there is. I mean, Evil Conduct is one of the greatest bands of all time. I'm trying to do you a favor here. But you said, I want to hear it. Skinhead music. But I like this song. Like I said, I'm not a skinhead. I never have been. I don't claim to be, but I love skinhead music. And if it is something that you're passionate about, it's got to be frustrating. It's got to be just vexing that people think that you're something that you aren't. Although, at the end of the day, who gives a shit what people think? If you looked around, most people listen to Post Malone and Jelly Roll. Don't concern yourself too much with what they think, son. Anyway, the next song on the second side is the second song on side 2 is a song called Yesterday's Glory. This is a sort of an acoustic jam. I remember when I first bought this album, and the first time I listened to it, just based on the title, I expected this to be sort of a skinhead song, Back to the Spirit of 69 type thing, which is a reoccurring theme through a lot of skinhead music, and I'm not judging, I love skinhead music, but this song sort of threw me for a loop the first time I heard it, and it is a song that I love, especially the message of, which is basically like, you know, don't live in the past. There really isn't any such thing as the good old days. There's just life. Live it. I always say the same thing when it comes to newer music. I hear people say all the time, oh man, there's no good music anymore. And although I do agree that good music that's coming out nowadays is less prevalent than it used to be, I've always maintained that there is good music out there. You just have to dig a little bit deeper. I never, ever want to be that guy you see walking around and says, man, there hasn't been a good band since Jethro Tull. Because one, that's sad. Nobody takes you seriously. Nobody respects that point of view. And two, it's just not true. Now, yeah, if you want to skim the surface, the music that's popular nowadays is a bucket. It's pretty rough. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to disagree with you. But if you're willing to dig below the surface a little bit, there is still great music being made. You just have to be willing to invest a little bit of time. Now, if you don't have the time, I understand that. A lot of people are much busier than I am. A lot of people have children and actual careers, you understand? But I'm fortunate that I don't. So I sit up here in my record room and I dig through new music. I enjoy it. I like this song a lot. I like the message to it a lot, too. The next song after that is a song called Sorry. This is another one of the sort of acoustic jams, although I sort of can't help but wonder, considering this is a Canadian artist, if the song isn't called Sorry. Guilt. Sorry about that. I remember when I first moved to Seattle back in 1999, I had a friend. One of my first good friends from Seattle was from Manitoba. I believe he was from Winnipeg. Now, this is going to sound really stereotypical, but I swear to God, it's true. This guy was a hockey nut. I've never met anybody that was as into hockey as this guy was. Now, I grew up in California. Hockey wasn't really a big thing for us. I mean, we had the San Jose Sharks, but back in those days, the Sharks were still relatively new, and most people weren't interested in it. But this guy was a hockey fiend. And the funny thing about this guy was, I swear to God, you're going to think I'm making this up, but I'm not. He talked exactly like Bob and Doug McKenzie. Now, he denied that he had that sort of Canadian accent, but the only thing he didn't do was he didn't say A. He pretty much steered clear of that. I don't know if it was a conscious thing or not, but we used to sort of not make fun of him, but we used to sort of point out the fact that he had this crazy accent, and the fact that he was obsessed with hockey, to me, made him a very fun and interesting guy to hang out with. But he was actually the one, because I grew up in California, and I'm not the hugest sports guy in the world anyway, and even hockey is something I'm sort of a casual fan of at this point in time. But he was actually the one that kind of first got me into hockey, because he and I would go up to Vancouver every once in a while, and we'd go to Canucks games. And if you have not been to Vancouver, holy shit, you talk about an amazing city. But we used to sort of goose him because of his accent. I remember one time I said, "Hey man, what was it like when you had to get a student visa to come from Canada into the United States?" I imagine it being relatively simple, because it's not like you have to cross an ocean or anything. And I remember he's like, "Well, it's kind of a process." I was like, "What? What'd you just say? Did you say process?" But I remember one thing about him in particular was, we used to go up to Vancouver to go to hockey games. We did this not all the time, but we went up to a few Canucks games, and he and I would go up there, and we'd pregame, we'd postgame, we'd get a hotel, and then we'd drive back in the morning. And he was just way into hockey, and going to NHL games in Canada it's something that's just a different experience. It's fun. But I remember there was this shitty Canadian beer, and it's probably still up there, but stuff was called Pilsner, and he was just into it. And I don't know if it must have been a thing about being homesick or whatever, but we used to go up to Vancouver, and he would buy cases of this Pilsner, and it came in this bright yellow can. And I mean, I'm not picky. I'll drink anything. I'll drink shitty beer, I'll drink good beer. Doesn't really matter. I'm not exactly fussy. But I remember we were driving up to Canada the first time. He was telling me about this beer. He couldn't wait to get his hands on this Pilsner stuff. I was like, "Oh, it must be good." It's basically just swill. I mean, it's like Hams. But he used to bring back cases of this stuff back to his apartment in Seattle. And it was funny, whenever we would hang out at his house, and he had a really nice apartment in the basement of this house. Now, most of us sort of lived in squalid conditions back in those days, because we were a bunch of young dirtbags. But he lived in a nice house, and he was a super clean and responsible guy. But I remember we would always go to his house to have, nights where we'd drink and listen to music, and it was sort of a BYOB thing. And every time you'd walk in to his kitchen and go into his refrigerator, he'd look at you to make sure that you weren't stealing his Pilsners, which, he'd buy a case, for the night that we were in Vancouver. He and I'd go through like a 12-pack in the hotel room, but he would bring like 3 cases of this shit back to the United States. It was okay. It was like any other shitty regional beer. I mean, I'm not judging. Back in those days in Washington, we used to love Rainier, which actually Rainier was the jug. So actually, you can't get Rainier out here. That's one thing that sucks about living out here. Anyway, I don't know why I'm even on this topic. That was uninteresting. Anyway, the song "Sorry" is awesome. Again, another one of the acoustic songs. The next song after that is a song called "Living for Tonight," which is another one of the sort of acoustic jams. When I first, again, this was another one of those songs when I first bought this record. I was walking home looking at the track listing on the back, and I was wondering to myself, and this is a stupid thing to wonder at this point in time, but this was 15 years ago when I first bought this album. But there's a old German metal band called Accept that I'm not really a big metal guy, never really have been, but Accept are a band that I kind of like when it comes to metal. They're sort of in the Judas Priest, Iron Maiden sort of vein. But I remember wondering if this was a cover of the band Accept, because they have a song, I believe it's on their Metal Heart album, called "Living for Tonight." Obviously it's not, but for some reason that was the first thing I thought of when I saw the track listing for this song. Was I wonder if this is an Accept cover. Anyway, this song is sort of about the drudge of daily life, work, family, landlord, kids, boss, dog, and all of the pressure that sort of mounts throughout the week. And basically the song is about your escape on Friday night. You go out with your friends, you have a few drinks, maybe you go to a show, you just sort of blow off steam. I don't know that this is necessarily a party anthem, but I like the message in the song. I'm not somebody that goes out as much as I used to, but man, I remember, well, it didn't even have to be Friday night for me to go out back in the day, but you get through a long day of work, you look forward to going out, maybe knocking back some suds, listening to some tunes, hanging out with your friends. This is just, again, a good, feel-good, sort of positive song. One of the reasons why this album is something that I listen to when I'm having a hard time getting motivated. The fifth song on the side 2 is a song called Et tu Brute. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I don't speak whatever language this is, but that's the way that it sounds on the album. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I'm an idiot. Okay, I'm aware of that. God, leave me alone. Anyway, this is a song that I love. This one has, again, more of the sort of heavy, full-on electric punk type sound to it. I think the song is basically just about karma. If you live your life as a shit stain, you're probably going to die alone. But, if you're a good person, you live an honorable life, you leave something positive behind, the world will treat you accordingly. This is something that I sort of live my life by. Karma is something that I believe in with all of my heart. Leaving something positive behind is something that I am totally committed to. Now, I've mentioned this on this channel in the past. Back in my younger days, I could definitely be a negative creep, and I have days still where I'm not on my best behavior. But at a certain point in time, you reach a certain age, you, at least for me, you make a sort of conscious decision that you want to leave something positive behind. Life is short. What you leave behind, your legacy is sort of what you leave behind. How you become immortal, unless you're somebody like Elvis or the big guy, you become immortal through the stories, through people's memories, through the things that get passed on after you're gone. And do you just want to be that little stain that walks around making people unhappy, celebrating in other people's downfalls? I don't want to be like that. I sort of used to be like that. It was a certain point in time, you make a conscious decision that there's something positive. There's something good in leaving something positive behind. That's sort of the whole point of this stupid channel. I can come on here and talk about music I hate all day. That would be easy. But that's not what this channel is about. This channel is about celebrating these artists that I love. Music that has literally saved my life. Music can save your life. Music is the most positive thing in the world, at least in my experience. Apart from my friends and my family, music is basically everything. And that's why this channel is dedicated to positivity. Because when I have enough decency to finally go tits up, if this channel is still floating around out there somewhere, I want people who stumble. I mean, nobody watches it now, so the chances of people stumbling on it later are relatively slim, I would say. But if it happens, I want people to be like, oh, this guy loved music. This was a positive thing. I think that's basically what this song is all about, is, hey, just leave something positive behind. You don't have to be a stain your whole life. You don't have to be an internet troll. You don't have to just go around making people unhappy because your only joy comes from spreading that around. All right, the last song on this record is an acoustic song called Working Class Gospel. This is another sort of recurring theme throughout the music of Jenny Wu in her catalog. This song is basically making reference to the fact that she believes that there's no voice for the working class, something that I absolutely believe in. We had an election in this country very recently, which was, I think, sort of a referendum on that. I think that, and I'm not a political person, I don't really sit on either side of the aisle. I don't support either political party, but we just had an election in this country which had a somewhat controversial outcome, and if you want my honest opinion, it wasn't all that surprising. And I'm not saying that I support one person or the other, because I support neither, but one party in this country, in the United States at least, has always sort of been the voice of the working class, and it is the opinion of a lot of people that party has sort of turned their back on the working class. They've become too obsessed with Hollywood, too obsessed with the ultra elite. They are too obsessed with pushing a relatively hardcore social agenda, and it's sort of alienated a lot of people. So a lot of people sort of went the other direction. Now, you could make the argument that the candidate for the other party, the party that happened to win, at least our presidential campaign, doesn't really care about the working class. That's sort of where I come down on it. But he at least has enough sense to pay lip service. Now, does he really care about the working class? Of course he doesn't really care about the working class. Most people in power do not care about the working class anymore. And I think that's what this song is about. But at least he says something about it. Now, I'm not endorsing anybody. But at least he has enough sense to sort of at least pay lip service, and I think that's why the election went the way it did. Now, I don't think it's genuine. I don't think most people have a genuine concern about the plight of the working class, at least in this country. I'm an American. I can only speak on what goes on here, but that's just my opinion when it comes to American politics. But this is, again, a reoccurring theme through Jenny Wu's music, through the entire Oi music scene. I think that's one thing that attracts me so much to this style of music. I mean, I am all in on the working class. When it comes to my political views, which I don't really have that many, I'm not a political person, but most of my political views sort of are working class centric, I guess. So I think this is a great way to end the album. Now, the question I was thinking about as I was listening to this album again this week was, is this my favorite Jenny Wu album? That's a tough one. Because there's two really that I think you could say are my two favorites. I mean, this one is pretty close. The other one would be her solo album, Proud of Every Scar, which is jugs also. But of her solo albums, I'm going to say that this one's probably my favorite one because, one, it is the album that turned me on to her, and two, I mean, the song I'll Rise Again is probably my favorite song that she's ever done, at least as a solo artist. Like I said before, every time I hear that song, I mean, it almost honestly makes me emotional, almost makes me want to cry, because I think back to my younger self first sort of discovering the community of people that make up this style of music, and it really is something special. I genuinely believe that. I am a proud member of this sort of punk rock community. Now, like I said before, I'm not somebody that has a ton of friends. I'm not really hiring. But when I go to a show and I'm in that community, it does give you a sort of sense of belonging. It gives you a sort of sense that, yeah, life is okay. Not everybody are the people that I have to deal with when I go to work Monday through Friday. So I'd say that this is probably my favorite album of hers. Although I do have Proud of Every Scar on vinyl as well, and I will be bringing that record to the channel at a certain point in time. But I got to tell you, before I get out of here, that Jenny Wu is not only a tremendous solo artist, but she is currently a member of one of my contemporary musical obsessions, and that is the band The Choices. Their newest album, Vice and Virtue, was one of my top 5 favorite records of 2023. In fact, I believe it came in at number 2, only behind the newest album by the band Sweeping Promises. So if you have not listened to The Choices, they are based out of Paris, France, I believe. Go back and listen to those albums. Those are what I have just been obsessed with in terms of her career at this point in time. Now, according to their socials, this is a band that does have some activity planned for next year. Now, I would love it if this band would come over here to the United States. Now, I don't know if that's something that I necessarily see in their future, especially living here in Nashville. Nashville's such a weird market for sort of underground punk bands. They just have a tendency not to support these shows very well. But there are cities close by that have a much better sort of DIY underground punk rock kind of community. Cities that are very drivable from Nashville, places like Memphis, Birmingham, Atlanta, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, places like that, that would probably support a show by a band like The Choices better than Nashville, if I were going to give this band any advice, not that they're asking, mind you, but if I were going to give the choices, any advice would be like, I don't know about Nashville. Last year, earlier this year, I went to go see that band Booze and Glory, who is a band that I really like a lot, and they played at this place called the Cobra in Nashville, which is this really is our one very underground DIY punk venue, and I mean the show just didn't do very well. I was sort of bummed out about it because Booze and Glory, despite the fact that I don't love their name as a band, I think that they are awesome. So, but this is a band. The choices, if they did come to the United States, man, I would be willing to travel. I travel to shows all the time. My wife and I are always going to Birmingham or Memphis. We went to Cincinnati 2 weeks ago for a show. On Friday, I'm traveling up to Indy to see the Big Dog. So I'm more than willing to travel. So come to the United States with the choices. I do know that they do have some activity planned for next year. So that is a band that is alive and well, and you have to go check them out. Check out their records, if nothing else. They are the choices. And also check out Alberta Rose and Proud of Every Scar by Canadian punk rock songstress Miss Jenny Wu. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store, like Singles Going Steady in Seattle, Washington. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And I guess that's just about gonna do her. So if there's a next time, my friends, talk to you then.